Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping back quite a way, back to 1848, a single year that really just turned the map
Mm.
and the politics of Europe completely upside down.
Yeah, it's often called the springtime of nations, or sometimes the springtime of peoples.
Mm.
A bit romantic, maybe.
Definitely sounds it. But it describes what was, well, arguably the most intense, widespread revolutionary wave Europe had ever seen up to that point.
Oh, the scale is just, it's staggering when you look at it. We're talking about uprisings and changes affecting over 50 different countries and territories.
50, wow.
Yeah. And it sort of started, well, not exactly quietly, but maybe less dramatically in Sicily, January 1848. But then, boom, within just a few months, it exploded. Paris, Prague, Vienna, Venice, all the way east, even into places like Wallachia.
Okay, so clearly not just a local Sicilian issue then.
Yeah.
What was the common thread? I mean, with that kind of spread, the specific problems must have varied a lot, right?
They did, absolutely. Local grievances were everywhere. But the core demands, surprisingly, had this remarkable consistency across the continent.
And those were,
Fundamentally, they were democratic and liberal demands. People wanted to dismantle the old entrenched monarchical systems. And in many places, think Germany, Italy, the Habsburg lands, there was this huge push to create independent, unified nation states.
fueled by that romantic nationalism idea that was really taking hold.
Exactly. That was a powerful, powerful force in the 1840s, this idea of the nation, the people.
Still, it feels like a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
To get that kind of continent-wide
Yeah.
combustion, you need more than just nationalism and some liberal ideas, surely.
Okay, let's unpack this. What was the potent mix? What actually lit the fuse for all this?
Yeah, good question. You really have to look at the underlying pressures that had been building for decades. Many historians talk about this sort of hangover from the dual revolution.
I do a revolution.
Yeah, the combined shockwaves from, one, the political ideas unleashed by the French Revolution, and two, the massive social and economic upheaval caused by the Industrial Revolution. Together, they created this deep, simmering, well, a crisis in the development of the new society, as some put it. All right, that makes sense. Politics and economics colliding. So
Yeah.
rapid, disruptive change always creates friction.
Always. And it created a perfect storm, really. You had demands for political rights meeting, just sheer economic desperation.
Let's start with the economic side then. The sources, well, they paint a pretty brutal picture, especially of city life.
Well, urban life was getting rapidly worse for huge numbers of people. Industrialization was picking up speed, right? And this led to fierce competition. You had the rising middle class, the bourgeoisie, kind of jostling with this rapidly growing industrial working class.
And conditions for those workers were bad.
Horrific. I mean, truly horrific. Unskilled laborers working 12, sometimes 15 hours a day, living crammed into these squalid, disease-ridden slums. We see life expectancy actually plummeting in some of these new urban districts.
And it wasn't just the factory workers, was it? The sources point out that the traditional artisans, the skilled craftspeople, they were also getting squeezed.
Absolutely crushed in many cases. They'd relied on the old guild systems, But now mechanization was just decimating their livelihoods.
Like the example of the German tailors.
Exactly. Highly skilled work, carefully honed craft, suddenly undercut by cheap, mass-produced clothes pouring out of new factories, particularly in Prussia. They just couldn't compete on price or speed.
So their whole way of life, their social standing, was just eroding.
Precisely. And that erosion fueled a lot of the radical sentiment, especially in the German states. These weren't just unskilled laborers. These were formerly respected members of society pushed to the brink.
Okay, so you had this long-term structural decline, this grinding misery, and then came a shock, right? The economic panic of 1847.
Yes, that was the immediate trigger for widespread economic collapse. It hit hard and fast, mass layoffs, bankruptcies everywhere.
Any specific numbers?
Yeah, the sources give some stark examples, like 10,000 factory workers in Vienna lost their jobs almost overnight. In Hamburg, 128 firms went bust. It was a sharp, sudden downturn.
And you can see a link between the countries hit by this panic and the ones that revolted.
Almost a perfect correlation. The industrial shockwave seems to map directly onto the revolutionary map, with one interesting exception, the Netherlands. They got hit economically too, but managed to avoid major political upheaval, something to maybe circle back to.
Okay, so that covers the cities. But Europe was still overwhelmingly rural then. How did the countryside figure into this instability? Was it linked to the urban movements?
Often disconnected, actually. Rural discontent had its own dynamics, but it was just as explosive. A major factor was the massive food crisis.
The potato failure.
The European potato failure, exactly. 1845, 1846. We often focus on the Great Famine in Ireland, understandably, but it was a continental disaster.
Right. It hit everywhere.
Pretty much all of Northern Europe suffered famine or near-famine conditions, and the numbers are just, well, terrifying. Rye harvests in the Rhineland, a key grain area, dropped to like 20% of normal levels. The potato harvest in the Czech lands was cut in half.
Which means food prices.
Went through the roof. Wheat prices more than doubled in places like France and Habsburg, Italy. And that led directly to hundreds of local food riots. People were starving.
And on top of the hunger, you still had these old, oppressive feudal structures lingering, didn't you?
Yeah.
Especially in Eastern and Central Europe.
Yes, absolutely. That's crucial. Feudalism wasn't entirely gone. Peasants were still struggling with not enough land, and they still owed obligations to landowners.
Like the robot.
Exactly, the robot in the Habsburg lands. Basically, mandatory unpaid labor. Imagine facing starvation and still being forced to work for free for your lord.
Desperate situation.
Totally desperate. And it led to things like a huge increase in wood theft from common lands, just people trying to survive. Conviction rates for that soared in places like the Palatinate. So the peasants were hungry, often in debt, and increasingly criminalized just for trying to stay alive.
So this dual crisis, industrial misery in the cities, feudal pressure and famine in the country, that's the fuel. Now the ideas, how did these radical concepts provide the spark, the blueprint for change?
They provided the ideological engine, the language for revolt. And you have to remember, these ideas, democracy, liberalism, socialism, they sounded really radical in the 1840s, subversive.
So what did democracy mean to them then? Not just voting, presumably.
No, it meant universal manhood suffrage, getting rid of the old systems where only property owners could vote. A massive change.
And liberalism.
Liberalism primarily meant the consent of the governed, so constitutional rule, parliaments, and crucially, individual freedoms. Freedom of the press was a huge one, freedom of assembly, freedom from arbitrary arrest.
Okay, and socialism, that term must have been quite new, quite fluid.
Very fluid. It didn't have one single definition, not like today. But in the 1840s context, it consistently meant demanding more power for working people, better economic conditions, and often some form of worker control or ownership over production. It was fundamentally about economic rights alongside political ones.
And these ideas spread quickly.
Incredibly quickly, thanks to cheaper printing, rising literacy rates, newspapers, pamphlets. They gave the widespread discontent a voice, a framework.
All right, so you have the fuel, you have the spark. Which brings us to the actual explosion. You mentioned the speed was astonishing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Yes. The revolution seemed to unfold in these 4 incredibly distinct, fast-paced seasons, starting with spring 1848.
Which was surprisingly successful.
Astonishingly successful. The old regimes were just completely flat-footed. Leaders were forced to grant liberal constitutions almost overnight. Italy, German states, Austria.
Even Metternich, the arch-conservative, fled Vienna.
Yep, fled in disguise. And the biggest shock, perhaps? The French monarchy was overthrown again, and the Second Republic was declared. For a few months there, it really looked like the entire old order was just crumbling, a true springtime.
But those early alliances,
Yeah.
workers, middle class, liberals, radicals,
Yeah.
they were always going to be fragile, weren't they?
Extremely fragile. And they fractured very quickly. That brings us to summer 1848, division and strife.
Why did that coalition fall apart so fast and so violently?
Fundamentally, class interest and property. The middle-class liberals, they wanted their political rights, the Constitution, the Parliament, the vote for themselves. But they were deeply wary, often terrified, of the workers' demands for economic change.
Socialism.
Exactly. They feared socialism meant chaos, the end of private property. And the minute the workers pushed for more radical economic reforms, the middle class balked.
And the French example here is just brutal. The June Days uprising.
And it really is the starkest example. The provisional government in Paris had set up these national workshops, sort of state-funded work programs to guarantee jobs for the unemployed.
A concession to the workers.
A major concession. But the more conservative middle-class elements in the government saw them as, well, dangerously radical, inefficient, expensive, and basically socialism in action. So in June, they abruptly shut them down.
And the workers responded.
With barricades in the streets. It turned into incredibly bloody street fighting in Paris. But this time, the middle class, now organized in the National Guard and backed by the regular army, crushed the workers' uprising. Thousands killed, thousands more arrested or deported.
A turning
A
point.
decisive one. It showed the middle class chose order and property over continuing the revolution with their working class allies. That unity was shattered. And elsewhere, like in Germany, reformers just got bogged down in endless debates in their new assemblies, achieving very little concrete progress.
They lost momentum,
Yeah.
which leads, I suppose inevitably, to autumn 1848 and into 1849, the reaction.
Yes. The pendulum swung back hard. The aristocracy, the monarchs, the military leaders, the forces of reaction, they had been stunned initially, but they weren't defeated. They saw the divisions in the revolutionary ranks and exploited them brilliantly.
Yeah.
They regrouped their loyal armies and launched coordinated counter-revolutions across Europe, and they were ruthless. We're talking tens of thousands killed in the fighting and the repression that followed, even more forced into exile or thrown into prison.
So by late 1849,
By October 1849, pretty much every single revolutionary regime established in the spring had been overthrown. The old rulers were back, often ruling with even more authoritarian power than before. The springtime was well and truly over.
let's look at some specific examples to see how this played out differently. France, as always, seems like a whirlwind.
France is the classic case of revolutionary instability, isn't it? February Revolution, Second Republic declared, full of hope. By June, civil war in the streets, and that chaos paved the way for it.
Louis Napoleon Bonaparte,
Yeah.
Napoleon's nephew.
The very same. He played on the name recognition, presented himself as a figure of order, gets himself elected president in late 1848, then, less than 3 years later, pulls off a coup d'etat in December 1851, dissolves the republic, and declares himself Emperor Napoleon III.
So France went from monarchy to republic back to an empire in less than 4 years. Incredible.
It showed just how much the French bourgeoisie, and much of the peasantry too, feared instability and radicalism more than they desired liberty by that point. They chose authoritarian stability.
Alexis de Tocqueville nailed it, didn't he? That quote about society being cut in two.
Yes, it's perfect. Society was cut in two. Those who had nothing united in common envy, and those who had anything united in common terror. That really captures the class division that doomed the Republic. The propertied classes were so terrified of the envy of the poor, of potential communism, that they threw their lot in with a dictator to protect themselves.
Okay, so that's the rapid implosion in France. Contrast that with the Habsburg Empire, particularly Hungary. That was a much longer, bloodier struggle.
Oh, the Hungarian Revolution was the longest lasting and, in many ways, the most formidable challenge to the old order. The Hungarian patriots, led by figures like Lajos Kossuth, were incredibly organized and passionate.
They had clear demands, the 12 points.
Yes, the 12 points laid it all out. An independent Hungarian government responsible to a parliament, a national guard, abolition of censorship, union with Transylvania, equality before the law. It was a comprehensive program for a modern nation-state.
And they actually achieved independence for a while.
They did. They fought off the initial Austrian attempts to crush them and declared full independence in April 1849. They had a functioning government, a motivated national army. It was a serious state-building project.
But the reaction, when it came, was overwhelming.
Utterly overwhelming. The Austrians alone couldn't defeat the Hungarians. So the young Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph called for help from his fellow autocrat, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia.
Gendarme of Europe.
Exactly. Nicholas was terrified of revolution anywhere, especially nationalist revolution on his borders. He obliged by sending a massive Russian army, sources say over 300,000 troops crashing into Hungary from the east.
300,000 against that kind of force.
Resistance was futile. Caught between the Austrians and this enormous Russian force, the Hungarian army was forced to surrender in August 1849. The repression afterward was brutal executions, imprisonment, years of martial law. It was a stark message. The old empires would use overwhelming force, including foreign intervention, to crush nationalism.
A very different outcome from France's internal collapse. Now, at the other extreme, you mentioned Denmark as an exception. Peaceful transition.
Relatively peaceful, yes. It's a fascinating contrast. Denmark also has strong liberal and nationalist movements demanding change, but crucially, the monarch handled it differently.
King Frederick VII.
Yes, he'd just come to the throne in January 1848, right as things were heating up. Faced with large demonstrations demanding a constitution, instead of calling out the troops, he essentially gave in.
Just like that.
Pretty much. He dismissed his conservative ministers, appointed reformers, and agreed to end absolute monarchy. By 1849, Denmark had a liberal constitution and a bicameral parliament, the Riksdag. It moved from absolutism to constitutional monarchy without a major violent revolution.
And there's that great anecdote about him.
Ah, yes. The story goes that after signing away his absolute power, his first words were supposedly, "That was nice, now I can sleep in the mornings."
Whether it's true or not, it kind of captures the difference, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
It highlights that where the ruling elite was willing to compromise and concede power, a peaceful or at least less bloody transition was possible. But in most of Europe, that wasn't the case. The immediate result was defeat, humiliation, and renewed repression.
Which brings us back to that common view, 1848, a failure. A turning point where history failed to turn, as one historian famously put it. You mentioned the anarchist Proudhon's quote.
Yes, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, writing right afterwards, was utterly demoralized. "We have been beaten and humiliated, scattered, imprisoned, disarmed, and gagged. The fate of European democracy has slipped from our hands. You can feel the despair."
And the facts on the ground seem to back him up, right? The repression was real.
Oh, very real. As we noted, the Austrian Empire became a police state.
Yeah.
State surveillance, censorship, arrests skyrocketed from maybe 70,000 in 1850 to reportedly 1 million by 1854. Political activity just went underground or ceased altogether across much of Europe.
This led to the wave of emigration, the 48ers.
Exactly. Thousands of disillusioned revolutionaries, liberals, radicals who saw no future in Europe, around 4,000 or so are estimated to have fled, mainly to the United States. People like Carl Schurz, who became a prominent U.S. politician in general, they carried those ideals elsewhere.
So immediate picture. Failure, repression, exile. But is that the whole story? You mentioned historian Priscilla Robertson arguing for a longer-term view.
Right. If you step back and look beyond 1849 or 1850, the picture becomes more nuanced. Robertson and others argue that while the revolutions failed in their immediate aims of establishing stable liberal republics, many of their core goals were actually achieved within a couple of decades.
Achieved by their enemies.
Often, yes. The conservative regimes that crushed the revolutions realized they couldn't just turn back the clock entirely. They were forced to modernize, to adopt some of the revolutionaries' demands to ensure their own survival and stability.
Okay, like what? What were the lasting changes that couldn't be undone?
The biggest, most fundamental one was the final death blow to feudalism in Central Europe. The peasant obligations, the robot, serfdom where it lingered, that was gone. Abolished permanently in Austria and Prussia by 1850. Even Russia finally abolished serfdom in 1861, partly spurred by the lessons of 1848.
So the legal foundation of the old aristocratic land-based power was dismantled.
Exactly. That was a profound, irreversible social change. Even if peasants didn't immediately become prosperous landowners, their legal status changed forever.
And politically. Any lasting gains?
Well, France, despite becoming an empire again, kept universal male suffrage. That precedent was hard for other countries to ignore in the long run, and the sheer pressure of 1848 forced regimes like the Habsburg monarchy to seriously reform their administration.
Which led eventually to the Ausgleich.
Precisely. The Compromise of 1867 that created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. It was a way for the Habsburgs to manage the powerful Hungarian nationalism that had nearly destroyed them in 1848. And ironically, who helped negotiate it? Former Hungarian revolutionaries like Gyula and Dressy.
So the old guard had to adapt, had to incorporate some of the forces they'd fought against.
They had to. 1848 proved the old ways were simply unsustainable. The aristocracy couldn't just run things like their personal fiefdoms anymore. They now had to contend, however reluctantly, with nationalism, with demands for constitutionalism, with a more mobilized public sphere.
So 1848, not an immediate victory for liberal democracy, but a catalyst. It forced change, even if it wasn't the change the revolutionaries initially wanted. Okay, before we wrap up, there's one more darker aspect to the legacy you mentioned earlier, anti-Semitism.
Yes, it's a really important and disturbing part of the story. Several historians, notably Reinhard Rupp in the German context, argue that 1848 was a key moment in the development of modern political anti-Semitism.
How so?
Well, in that atmosphere of intense social upheaval, economic anxiety, political chaos, the collapse of the old order, the feel of the new industrial economy, existing prejudices against Jews, fused with these new anxieties in dangerous ways.
Conspiracy theories emerged.
Exactly. Conspiracy theories that painted Jews in this contradictory, impossible position simultaneously as the symbols of exploitative international finance and as subversive agents of social revolution. They were blamed for both capitalism and socialism, depending on who was doing the blaming.
That's a classic scapegoating mechanism. Blame a visible minority for complex problems you don't understand or can't control.
Precisely. We even have reports from places like Vienna at the time, amidst all the turmoil and economic hardship, explicitly stating things like, tyranny comes from money and the money belongs to the Jews.
Wow. Pinning the blame for systemic problems directly onto an entire group.
It shows how readily deep-seated prejudice can be mobilized during times of crisis. It was easier for some, including elements of the old and even new elites, to deflect blame onto Jews rather than confront the failures of the existing economic and political systems. It's a pattern we've seen repeated, tragically.
Okay, so summing up, 1848, the springtime of nations. It starts with this incredible continent-wide explosion of hope for liberal national states. It largely fails in the short term, crushed by conservative reaction, but it leaves behind crucial long-term changes.
Absolutely. It fatally wounded feudalism, forced monarchies to modernize and eventually concede constitutional limits, and cemented nationalism as a dominant political force they couldn't ignore. The old aristocratic order was proven fundamentally fragile.
It was a failure that, in a way, ultimately succeeded in changing the game, even if the players who won weren't the ones who started the revolution.
A harsh education for Europe, you could say. It revealed not only potential for democratic change, but also the deep divisions within society and the dangerous ways political and economic fear can manifest.
Which brings us to that final provocative thought. You highlighted that quote from Vienna, linking tyranny, money, and the Jews.
Yes. It raises a really relevant question, I think. In a period of rapid, almost overwhelming change in information, think of the impact of cheap print then, maybe analogous to the internet now. How quickly can widespread social and economic anxieties merge with existing prejudices? How easily are scapegoats created and weaponized politically when people feel like the world is spinning out of control?
It's a dynamic from the 1840s, but it feels incredibly contemporary. Something for you, the listener, to definitely mull over.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the complex, contradictory, and ultimately transformative year of 1848.